August 6, 1945, 08:15 hours. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. A single decoded transmission from Hiroshima would shatter 3 years of carefully constructed illusions about industrial warfare. What the Japanese High Command read in that message would force them to confront a truth they had spent the entire war denying. America hadn't been fighting at full capacity. They had been holding back. The basement war room beneath the Imperial Palace sat 90 feet underground, insulated by reinforced concrete walls 4 feet thick. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the space hummed with the familiar rhythm of a losing war. Field Marshal Shinroku Hata's morning intelligence briefing had become a ritual of managed decline, a careful presentation of bad news wrapped in optimistic projections that fooled no one but allowed everyone to continue functioning. At precisely 08:15 hours, Communications Officer Lieutenant Colonel Teishi Yamamoto burst through the steel door without the customary bow, a breach of protocol so severe that every head in the room turned instantly. In his hands, he carried a decoded transmission that would fundamentally alter how Japan's military leadership understood the war they had been fighting. The message was fragmentary, transmitted by the Hiroshima Regional Military Command before all communications ceased. Entire city destroyed by single bomb. Blast radius exceeds all previous bombardment. Unknown weapon type. Casualties catastrophic. Request immediate. The transmission ended mid-sentence, cutting off as if the operator himself had been consumed by whatever had struck the city. General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, read the message 3 times, his eyes scanning the characters as if repetition might change their meaning. His first assumption was that American B-29s had conducted the largest conventional bombing raid of the war, perhaps 500 aircraft dropping incendiaries simultaneously in a coordinated strike that overwhelmed Hiroshima's defenses. The mathematics seemed impossible otherwise. Hiroshima was a city of 350,000 people, spread across 27 square miles, with robust civil defense preparations and established evacuation protocols. For a single bomb to destroy the entire city suggested something that violated every principle of warfare the Japanese military understood. But additional reports arriving throughout the morning told a different story, one that made less sense with each new piece of information. Weather reconnaissance aircraft had reported only 3 B-29s over Hiroshima that morning. 3 aircraft, not 300, not even 30. 3. Admiral Toyoda, Chief of the Naval General Staff, stood at the massive wall map tracking every known American military asset in the Pacific. His intelligence staff had become exceptionally skilled at predicting American operations over 3 years of warfare. They knew bomber formations, typical ordnance loads, expected damage patterns, and could estimate casualties with unsettling accuracy. Nothing in 3 years of air war suggested 3 aircraft could destroy an entire city. A single B-29 carried approximately 8 tons of bombs in a typical configuration. Even if all 3 aircraft had been loaded with incendiaries and struck with perfect coordination, the expected damage radius would be measured in city blocks, not square miles. By 10 hours, reconnaissance flights attempting to reach Hiroshima reported something unprecedented, something that defied meteorological explanation. Pilots described a mushroom-shaped cloud rising over 40,000 feet, visible from 150 miles away across the inland sea. The cloud glowed with colors they had never seen in natural atmospheric phenomena. Purples and oranges that seemed to pulse with internal light, as if the sky itself had been set on fire. The radio transmissions from these pilots carried an edge of panic that experienced combat aviators rarely displayed. They reported that their instruments were malfunctioning as they approached the city, that the air itself felt different, that something fundamentally wrong had happened to the atmosphere over Hiroshima. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo received the first eyewitness account from a railway official who had been 15 miles outside Hiroshima when the weapon detonated. The man's testimony, recorded by Togo's secretary in shaking handwriting, described a flash brighter than 1,000 suns that had turned night into day for a single instant. He reported a pressure wave that knocked trains off their tracks, shattered windows 10 miles from the city center, and created winds that tore trees from the ground. He reported that the entire city center had simply vanished, replaced by a firestorm visible from the mountains, a column of smoke and flame that rose straight into the stratosphere as if hell itself had opened beneath Hiroshima. The afternoon meeting of the Supreme War Council convened at 1400 hours in complete silence. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, who had survived multiple assassination attempts for even suggesting peace negotiations, read the accumulated reports with hands that trembled slightly as he placed the documents on the table. The room contained the most powerful military and political figures in Japan, men who had commanded armies, directed naval battles, and made decisions affecting millions of lives. Yet they sat in silence, confronting information that made no sense within any framework they understood.
For 3 years, Japanese military doctrine had been built on a single premise that now seemed laughably naive. American industrial might could be overcome by Japanese spiritual strength and tactical innovation. The Americans could produce more ships, more planes, more tanks, but Japanese forces would fight with such ferocity that American casualties would become politically unbearable. This calculation had guided every decision since Pearl Harbor, had justified every sacrifice, had explained every defeat as merely a temporary setback on the path to ultimate victory through sheer determination. When American industry produced 300,000 aircraft during the war, Japan's leaders told themselves the Japanese pilots, though outnumbered 10 to 1, would fight with 10 times the spirit and therefore achieve parity through superior will. When American shipyards launched cargo vessels so quickly that they outpaced German U-boats sinking them, Japan consoled itself that American sailors lacked the warrior's heart, that they fought for paychecks rather than honor, and that this spiritual deficiency would eventually manifest as strategic weakness. But a single bomb that could destroy an entire city suggested something far more troubling than mere industrial superiority. It suggested that American industrial and scientific capacity had reached levels that made Japanese resistance not merely difficult, but meaningless. It suggested that America had been developing weapons in secret while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war across the entire globe. It suggested that everything Japan's military leadership believed about the nature of modern warfare, about the relationship between spirit and material, about the ultimate supremacy of human will over mechanical production, was not just wrong, but catastrophically, lethally obsolete. Intelligence officer Colonel Hideko Sato presented the afternoon's analysis at 1600 hours. His team had been calculating American industrial capacity since 1941, and their numbers had been consistently, terrifyingly accurate, though High Command had repeatedly dismissed their reports as defeatist exaggeration. America had produced 88,410 tanks during the war. Japan had produced 6,450. America had built 41 aircraft carriers of all types. Japan had built 15. American shipyards had launched Liberty ships so quickly that they completed vessels faster than German submarines could sink them, turning what should have been a war-winning strategy into a footnote. But Sato's new calculation suggested something that fundamentally broke their understanding of what was possible. If, he said, voice barely above a whisper, if the Americans can destroy entire cities with single bombs, then they possess scientific capabilities that render numerical comparisons meaningless. We have been counting their tanks and ships as if we were fighting the same kind of war. We are not fighting the same war. They are operating on a different plane of technological capability entirely. Foreign Minister Togo added what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say aloud. And if they have one such bomb, we must assume they have more. We must assume they can do this to every city in Japan, one by one, until nothing remains but ruins and radiation. The Japanese understanding of American power had been shaped by a series of carefully constructed beliefs that began long before Pearl Harbor. These beliefs, documented in countless staff meetings and strategic assessments preserved in military archives, would all collapse within days of Hiroshima. But to understand what the High Command finally realized on August 6th, one first must understand what they had convinced themselves was true, what comfortable lies they had told themselves to justify a war they should never have started. In November 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, had provided the most accurate assessment of American industrial capacity that any Japanese leader would offer during the entire war. His warning, recorded in naval staff minutes that would later be studied by historians trying to understand how Japan could have been so blind, was explicit and devastating. I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year. Yamamoto had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had toured American factories and witnessed the industrial infrastructure firsthand, had seen the automobile plants that could be converted to tank production, the shipyards that stretched for miles along both coasts, the steel mills that produced more in a month than Japan produced in a year. His calculations were not based on hope or nationalist fervor, but on old mathematics that admitted no argument. America's steel production alone exceeded Japan's total industrial output across all categories. American petroleum reserves were effectively unlimited compared to Japan's precarious dependence on imports from conquered territories that would need to be defended. American agricultural capacity could feed both a civilian population and a massive military force, while Japan already struggled to feed its people in peacetime. But Yamamoto's warnings were systematically ignored by the very staff now sitting in the underground bunker contemplating Hiroshima's destruction, dismissed as the pessimism of a man who had spent too much time in America and absorbed their merchant mentality.
The Army's strategic planning documents from 1941, recovered from archives after the war and studied by occupation historians, revealed the alternative narrative that military leadership had embraced. American industrial might would be neutralized by 3 factors that seemed logical at the time, but would prove to be fantasy. First, distance. Japan's conquests would secure a defensive perimeter so vast that American logistics would collapse under its own weight. Every ship, every aircraft, every bullet would need to travel 5,000 miles across hostile ocean before reaching combat zones. Japan could sustain its forces from nearby conquered territories, while America exhausted itself, maintaining impossible supply chains. Second, morale. American society was soft, individualistic, and incapable of sustaining the heavy casualties that total war required. Japanese military doctrine assumed that after losing 30,000 to 40,000 men, American public opinion would demand peace negotiations. The Japanese soldiers' willingness to die would outlast America's willingness to fight. Democracy would prove to be a strategic weakness when faced with determined authoritarianism. Third, tactical superiority. Japanese forces, through superior training, warrior spirit, and tactical innovation, would inflict casualty ratios that made American numerical advantages irrelevant. One Japanese soldier would equal 3 or 4 Americans in combat effectiveness, turning every battle into a victory regardless of the odds. These assumptions had been tested and found catastrophically wanting at every single engagement of the Pacific War, yet Japanese high command had consistently reinterpreted defeats as validation of their theories, needing minor adjustments rather than fundamental revision. At Midway, in June 1942, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers in a single day, the elite striking force that had attacked Pearl Harbor destroyed in one afternoon. The official assessment blamed bad luck and tactical errors, not American cryptographic superiority that had broken Japanese naval codes, not the fundamental vulnerability of Japan's carrier-focused strategy against an enemy with better intelligence and more resources. The underlying assumption that Japanese forces could overcome numerical disadvantages through superior spirit remained intact. At Guadalcanal, from August 1942 to February 1943,
Japanese forces discovered that Americans could sustain logistics across vast distances that were supposed to be impossible, that American soldiers could match Japanese troops in jungle warfare, that democracy did not produce weak soldiers. The official assessment blamed local commanders for insufficient fighting spirit, not the impossibility of the strategic situation, not the fact that American industry was delivering more supplies to Guadalcanal every week than Japan could transport in a month. The underlying assumption that American society would crack under sustained casualties remained intact, even as American forces advanced island by island, accepting casualties that should have broken their will, but instead seemed to strengthen their resolve. By August 1945, every major assumption had been systematically demolished by reality. Yet senior leadership had never formally acknowledged this, had never sat down and admitted that their entire strategic framework was built on lies. General Anami's continued advocacy for fighting to the last citizen represented not stupidity, but the logical endpoint of beliefs that had never been properly questioned, never been subjected to the harsh scrutiny that might have saved millions of lives. The afternoon of August 6th marked the first time in the entire war that Japan's Supreme War Council confronted their illusions directly, without the comfortable buffer of propaganda and wishful thinking. Intelligence Colonel Sato presented what he called the reality assessment, a document his team had compiled over the previous 6 months, but had been prevented from presenting until now because High Command deemed it harmful to morale. The numbers were devastating, a comprehensive demolition of every assumption that had guided Japan's strategy. American aircraft production in 1944 alone exceeded Japan's total production for the entire war from 1941 to 1945. American shipyards were building escort carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from them. American ammunition factories produced more artillery shells in a single week than Japan's factories produced in a month. But Sato's most damning statistics involved scientific research, the area where Japan's leadership had assumed relative parity. His intelligence network had documented American research facilities employing over 130,000 scientists and engineers working on military technology. Japan's comparable effort employed approximately 6,000, and most of those were working on incremental improvements to existing weapons rather than revolutionary new technologies. American research universities, Harvard, MIT, Berkeley, Chicago, had larger physics departments than Japan's entire scientific community. The atomic bomb, Sato explained with a chart that showed the scale of facilities required, demanded infrastructure that we could not have built even if we had known how. The Americans had constructed entire cities, in secret, hidden from the world while they waged war across 2 oceans: Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, Los Alamos, New Mexico. These facilities consumed more electricity than major Japanese cities. They employed 130,000 workers who had been building the weapon that destroyed Hiroshima. The Manhattan Project cost $2 billion, more than Japan spent on its entire war effort in 1944. And America had funded it while simultaneously producing tanks and ships and aircraft in quantities that seemed physically impossible.
Foreign Minister Togo asked the question that would echo through subsequent war crimes trials and historical analysis for decades. How could we not know? How could intelligence operations spanning 3 years miss something this massive? Sato's answer was uncomfortable but accurate, an indictment of the entire command structure. We knew, Foreign Minister. Our intelligence services reported on American industrial expansion continuously. We intercepted communications about large-scale secret projects in remote locations. We documented their scientific recruitment efforts, tracked the movement of prominent physicists, noted the construction of massive facilities consuming extraordinary amounts of power. But every report was dismissed as exaggeration or enemy propaganda designed to undermine morale. We chose not to know because knowing would require acknowledging that we could not win, that we had never been able to win, that this war was lost before it began. Admiral Toyoda added his own bitter assessment, speaking with a candor that would have been impossible weeks earlier. The Americans, he said slowly, fought this war with one hand tied behind their back.
They fought Germany and Japan simultaneously while developing weapons we cannot comprehend. They produced more war material than we thought physically possible while maintaining their civilian economy at levels that exceeded peacetime production. They are not merely stronger than us, they are operating on a different level of civilization entirely, a different category of capability that makes comparison meaningless. This admission that America represented not just greater strength, but a different category of capability marked the fundamental shift in understanding. For 4 years, Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as materialistic and weak, dependent on machines because they lacked spiritual strength, fighting for money rather than honor. The atomic bomb revealed this narrative as catastrophically wrong. Americans had both material superiority and the determination to use it, both industrial capacity and the scientific genius to create weapons that seemed like they belonged in future centuries. August 7, 1945, began with confirmation that made Hiroshima seem even more incomprehensible. Reconnaissance aircraft that finally penetrated the radiation zone transmitted photographs that would circulate among high command within hours, images that military analysts would study in stunned silence. Major Sune Kitamura, the pilot who flew the first successful reconnaissance mission, reported weather conditions he had never encountered in 15 years of flying. Updrafts so powerful they threw his aircraft 2,000 feet higher in seconds. Air temperatures that spiked his instruments off their scales, and visibility obscured by smoke that rose in a column to the stratosphere, creating its own weather system that defied normal meteorology. The photographs, developed by 1100 hours in dark rooms beneath the Imperial Palace, showed something that military analysts initially refused to believe, insisting the images must be corrupted or mislabeled. The city center, approximately 4 square miles, had been completely flattened, not destroyed in the conventional sense where rubble and building foundations remained to show where structures once stood, but flattened to bare earth as if a giant hand had erased everything. Structures hadn't collapsed, they had been vaporized. The reconnaissance team estimated that everything within a mile of the blast center had ceased to exist in any recognizable form, transformed from buildings and streets and people into atomic shadows and dust. Intelligence analysts compared these images to conventional bombing results to quantify the difference in destructive capability. The most devastating conventional raid of the war, the Tokyo firebombing of March 9–10, 1945, had required 334 B-29 bombers, dropping 1,665 tons of incendiaries over 3 hours. Hiroshima's destruction exceeded that raid's devastation, accomplished by a single bomb from a single aircraft in a single instant. The entire concept of strategic bombing, of gradually destroying an enemy's capacity to fight through sustained campaigns, had become obsolete in one morning. The Supreme War Council reconvened at 1400 hours on August 7, 1945, with new intelligence that fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had summoned Japanese Ambassador Naotake Sato to the Kremlin at midnight Moscow time. The message was brief, delivered with bureaucratic coldness that somehow made it more terrifying. The Soviet Union would consider itself at war with Japan effective August 9, 1945. No declaration, no ultimatum, no opportunity for negotiation. Just a simple statement that one of the world's largest armies would be added to Japan's enemies. This announcement shattered Japan's final strategic hope. For months, Japanese diplomacy had worked desperately to negotiate Soviet mediation for peace terms that might salvage something from defeat. The fantasy was that Stalin, never fully trusted by his American and British allies, might broker an arrangement that preserved some Japanese territory and prevented occupation. Some in Tokyo had even imagined that Soviet fear of American power might lead to an unlikely alliance that would check American ambitions in Asia. The Soviets entering the war eliminated these possibilities completely, revealing them as the desperate delusions they had always been.
General Anami's face, according to multiple witnesses who recorded the moment, went pale as the implications registered. Japan now faced enemies on all fronts, with no prospect of negotiated settlement, no diplomatic avenue that might lead to anything other than unconditional surrender. American atomic weapons from the east, capable of destroying cities at will. Soviet armies from the north, the same forces that had destroyed Nazi Germany, now turning their attention to Japan's continental holdings. British Commonwealth forces from the south, advancing through Southeast Asia, and Chinese resistance continuing in occupied territories, tying down forces that could have been redeployed to defend the home islands. The empire that had once stretched from the borders of India to the mid-Pacific was being compressed back toward the home islands with crushing force from every direction. Foreign Minister Togo presented the stark reality in language that left no room for comforting interpretations. "We have three choices, gentlemen. Surrender unconditionally and accept whatever terms the Allies impose. Fight until every city is destroyed by atomic weapons and Japan becomes a radioactive wasteland. Or fight until Soviet and American forces invade and Japan ceases to exist as a nation, its people scattered, its culture destroyed, its very name erased from maps. There are no other options. There is no fourth choice where we negotiate favorable terms or preserve the empire. Those possibilities no longer exist." August 8th brought fragmentary intelligence about Soviet movements that confirmed fears about Russian military capability. The Red Army had launched a massive assault into Manchuria with overwhelming force that suggested they had been preparing this operation for months. The Kwantung Army, once the elite formation of Japanese military power, the force that had conquered Manchuria and held it for 14 years, was being systematically destroyed. Soviet tank columns advanced 50 miles in the first day, encountering resistance that collapsed before forces that had learned their trade destroying Nazi Germany. The speed of the Soviet advance suggested that Japanese defensive preparations, the fortifications and defensive positions that were supposed to hold for months, were being overrun in hours. At 11:02 hours on August 9th, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. The communication from the Nagasaki Regional Command was even briefer than Hiroshima's, as if the operators couldn't find words adequate to describe what they were witnessing. Second atomic attack, city destroyed, casualties catastrophic, then silence as communications ceased and another city vanished from Japan's map. The Supreme War Council emergency session that afternoon descended into something unprecedented in Japanese military protocol: open acknowledgement of complete strategic failure without the usual face-saving language or references to fighting spirit. Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai spoke with remarkable candor for a military officer in that environment, abandoning the careful language that usually characterized high-level discussions. "The Americans have demonstrated that they can destroy our cities at will, one by one, until nothing remains. They have demonstrated the capability to continue this indefinitely. We cannot defend against weapons we cannot detect until they detonate. Our anti-aircraft systems are irrelevant against aircraft flying at altitudes we cannot reach. Our fighter aircraft cannot intercept what they cannot find in time. Our civil defense preparations are meaningless when entire cities can be erased in an instant. We have no defense. We have no answer. We have no option except surrender." Army Chief of Staff General Umezu added his own assessment, one that would have been considered defeatist heresy weeks earlier, but now seemed like simple recognition of reality. The atomic bomb changes fundamental military calculations that have governed warfare for centuries. Concentrated forces become targets rather than strength. Cities become liabilities rather than centers of production. Our strategy of fighting to the last citizen assumes Americans must invade to occupy Japan. But if they can destroy cities without invasion, our entire defensive doctrine becomes obsolete. They can simply eliminate Japan from existence without ever setting foot on our soil, turning our islands into radioactive ruins devoid of life.
Intelligence estimates presented that evening calculated that America likely possessed between 3 and 7 additional atomic bombs, with production capacity for more, though these numbers were essentially guesses based on fragmentary intelligence. Even if this estimate was wildly high, even if America possessed only one more weapon, the strategic implication remained identical. Continued resistance was not just futile, but suicidal, guaranteed to result in the complete destruction of Japanese civilization. Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakumizu recorded the emperor's private comments from an audience that evening. His Majesty expressed that the unendurable must be endured. The atomic bombs have demonstrated that continued resistance will result in the complete annihilation of the Japanese people. We must accept terms that preserve the nation, even if those terms are painful beyond measure, even if they require us to abandon beliefs we have held sacred. The unendurable must be endured would become the foundation for Japan's surrender announcement, a way of framing defeat not as weakness but a different kind of strength, the strength to accept reality no matter how painful. But the path from this private imperial acknowledgement to actual surrender would require navigating military opposition that remained fierce despite overwhelming evidence. August 10th brought the formal Japanese surrender offer transmitted through Swiss diplomatic channels, Japan's last connection to neutral intermediaries. The message was conditional, a final attempt to salvage something from catastrophe. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration terms provided the emperor's sovereignty was maintained, that the institution representing 2,000 years of continuous history would survive defeat. The American response, delivered August 12th, was deliberately ambiguous in ways that created maximum psychological pressure. The emperor would be subject to the supreme commander of Allied powers, but his ultimate status would be determined by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. This ambiguity created the final crisis that nearly derailed surrender. Military hardliners led by General Anami interpreted this as unacceptable, as reducing the emperor to a mere figurehead, subject to foreign control. They argued for continuing resistance despite atomic weapons, despite Soviet invasion, despite the certainty of total destruction.